When he handed his wife divorce papers at her father's open grave, he had no idea he was making the most expensive mistake of his life. He thought he was discarding a broken, penniless woman with 3 hungry mouths to feed, but he was blind to the fact that the man being lowered into the earth had left behind a secret empire that would soon turn his world into ashes. Now, if you believe that a man who abandons his family at a funeral deserves to lose everything, hit that subscribe button right now. Don't let people like Dante win. Subscribe to Black Women's Soul and drop a comment saying, "Zora rises," to show your support. Only the heartless stay silent. Now, let's go back to the moment Zora's world collapsed. The air in St. Jude's Cemetery didn't just feel cold. It felt hollow, as if the very earth had inhaled all the warmth of the world and refused to let it go. Zora stood at the precipice of a jagged hole in the ground, her boots sinking into the thick, hungry mud that clung to her like a desperate memory. In her arms, she held the only 3 reasons she had left to keep breathing: Micah, Sophia, and Elijah. They were so small, barely 2 weeks old, their tiny faces tucked away from the biting wind in blankets that had grown thin from too many washes. Every time the wind howled through the skeletal trees of the graveyard, Zora felt a shudder go through her entire body, but she didn't move. She couldn't. She was anchored to this spot by the weight of the casket being lowered slowly, agonizingly into the dark void. Her father, Elias Morrison, was inside that box. The man who had smelled of cedarwood and old paper, the man who had spent his entire life in a dusty shop on 5th Street, was leaving her. He had been a man of few words, but his silence had always been a sanctuary for Zora. Now that sanctuary was being covered in dirt. Zora's eyes were dry, not because she wasn't grieving, but because the shock had parched her soul. She felt like a glass statue on the verge of shattering, held together only by the warmth of the 3 infants pressed against her chest. Beside her stood Dante, her husband of 3 years. Or at least, he was the man who occupied that title. Today, he looked like a stranger. He stood tall in his designer charcoal overcoat, his jaw set in a line of bored irritation. He wasn't looking at the casket. He wasn't looking at his wife. He was staring at his reflection in the polished surface of his smartphone, checking his hair, checking his messages, checking the time. To him, this burial was a chore, a smudge on his pristine Tuesday. He had always despised Elias, calling him a bottom feeder and a hoarder of trash. Zora reached out a hand, her fingers trembling, trying to find Dante's arm. She needed a touch, a sign that she wasn't drowning alone. But as her fingers brushed his sleeve, Dante flinched away as if her grief was contagious. He didn't look at her. Instead, he reached into his inner breast pocket and pulled out a heavy manila envelope. The sound of the paper sliding against his coat was loud in the silence of the cemetery, a crisp, clinical sound that cut through the priest's low chanting. "I need you to take this," Dante said. His voice wasn't filled with sorrow or even anger. It was flat, businesslike, the tone he used when dismissing an underperforming intern. Zora looked down at the envelope, her mind struggling to process the sight. "Dante, not now, please, my father is. They are still burying him." "There is no better time," Dante replied, finally looking at her. His eyes were devoid of the love he had promised her 3 years ago. "Your father was the only string holding this charade together. Now that he's gone, there's no point in pretending. I've already signed the papers. You should do the same before the ink on his death certificate is even dry." Zora felt a coldness spread from her stomach to her limbs, a numbness that was far more terrifying than the winter air. "Papers? Dante, what are you talking about?" He thrust the envelope into the crook of her arm, nearly jostling the babies. "Divorce, Zora, I'm moving on. I've spent 3 years waiting for you to become the woman I needed, a woman of status, a woman who could help me climb the ladder at Crestview. But you're just like him. You're satisfied with dust and shadows. I'm a man of the future, and you are a relic of a past I'm erasing today." Before Zora could find the strength to scream, a flash of vibrant, violent red appeared in the corner of her eye. Walking toward them, stepping over the graves of strangers with a playful arrogance, was Sloane. She was wearing a coat the color of fresh blood, her blonde hair perfectly coiffed despite the rain. She looked like a predator entering a wounded camp. She didn't stop until she was close enough to tuck her hand into the crook of Dante's elbow. "Don't make a scene, Zora," Sloane said, her voice dripping with mock sympathy. "It's so middle class to cry in public. Dante has been suffocating in that marriage. You were a weight around his neck, dragging him down into that pathetic little junk shop of yours. But don't worry, the house is being taken care of. Dante and I need the space for the nursery." Sloane's hand moved to her stomach, her fingers splayed out in a deliberate, cruel gesture. "I'm pregnant, Zora, a real heir, a single child who won't have to compete with, whatever those three are." She glanced at the triplets with a look of pure disgust, as if they were nothing more than a biological error. Dante nodded, his gaze returning to his watch. "You have 30 days to get your things out of my house." "And I mean your things, Zora. Anything I paid for stays. You can take your father's old ledgers and whatever rusted scrap metal you've hidden in the attic. I've already called the locksmith. The codes change at midnight." Zora's in-laws, Caroline and Richard, stood 10 feet away under a large black umbrella. They didn't come forward to offer a hand to their grandchildren. They didn't offer a word of comfort to the woman who had spent 3 years trying to win their approval. They simply watched with thin, satisfied smiles, nodding to Dante as if he had finally completed a difficult but necessary task. To them, Zora was a stain that had finally been bleached out of the family tapestry. "You're leaving me, now," Zora's voice finally broke, a raw, jagged sound that seemed to startle the birds in the nearby trees. "I have 2 week-old infants. My father is being buried right there. How can you be this monstrous?" Dante leaned in close, his breath smelling of expensive mints and cold ambition. "I'm not being monstrous, Zora. I'm being efficient. You brought nothing to this marriage but a father who sold garbage and a heart full of grand delusions. I'm giving you the freedom to go back to the mud where you belong." He turned on his heel, Sloane clinging to his arm like a trophy. They walked away, their expensive shoes clicking against the stone path, leaving Zora standing in the rain. She watched them get into the sleek black sedan, watched the taillights disappear into the mist, and felt the first heavy shovelful of dirt hit her father's casket. Thud, the sound of finality. Thud, the sound of a life discarded. Zora sank to her knees, the dampness of the grave soaking into her skirt. She looked at the envelope in the mud, then at the triplets who were beginning to fuss, their tiny cries joining the wind. She was a woman with no home, no husband, and no father. She was the daughter of a junk dealer, abandoned at the gates of death. But as she reached into her pocket to find a tissue for her tears, her fingers brushed against something hard and cold. It was the iron key Elias had given her in the hospital, his eyes burning with a strange, fierce light as he whispered his final words. "Don't look at the dirt, Zora, look at the key." In that moment, the grief in Zora's heart didn't vanish, but it began to calcify. It turned into something hard, something sharp, and something that could cut. She looked at the fresh mound of earth over her father and realized that Dante hadn't just divorced her. He had declared war. And he had no idea that the junk dealer he despised had spent 40 years arming his daughter for this exact battle. The drive from the cemetery to 5th Street felt like a journey through a ghost town. Zora sat in the back of an old, battered taxi, the scent of stale tobacco and wet upholstery filling her lungs. Every time the car hit a pothole, she winced, her body still aching from the labor of a triple birth just 14 days ago. She looked out the window at the blurred neon signs and the gray city skyline, feeling like she was a passenger in someone else's nightmare. She kept her eyes on the 3 small bundles beside her on the seat. Micah, Sophia, and Elijah were finally quiet, exhausted by the cold air of the graveyard, their tiny chests rising and falling in a rhythmic lullaby that was the only thing keeping Zora's mind from shattering. When the taxi pulled up to the corner of 5th and Elm, the driver didn't even want to wait for her to get out. He looked at the dilapidated front of Morrison's Curiosities with a look of disdain. The building was a narrow, 3-story brick structure that looked as though it were leaning against its neighbors for support. The windows were opaque with decades of soot, and the gold lettering on the sign had peeled away until it only read, Orisons. Dante had always called it a cancer on the block, a place that lowered the property value of everything around it. To the rest of the world, it was a graveyard for things that time had forgotten. Zora stepped out into the rain, clutching her babies. She stood on the sidewalk, watching the taxi's red taillights vanish into the fog. She was alone, truly alone. She looked at the heavy oak door, the wood scarred and weathered, and felt a wave of nausea. This was her inheritance. A crumbling shop filled with rusted iron, broken clocks, and the smell of her father's unfulfilled dreams. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the iron key. It felt unnaturally heavy, the metal cold against her palm. As she slid it into the lock, she expected it to grind, to resist, to scream like everything else in her life was currently doing. But the key turned with a silent, buttery smoothness that startled her. The lock didn't just open, it glided. As the door swung inward, the air from the shop rushed out to meet her. It didn't smell like rot or decay. It smelled of expensive cedar, aged parchment, and a strange, sharp scent that reminded her of ozone before a lightning strike. Zora stepped inside, the floorboards under her feet feeling solid and firm, not creaking like she remembered. She fumbled for the light switch, her fingers finding a brass toggle she had never noticed before. When the lights flickered on, Zora gasped. These weren't the dim, yellowed bulbs of her childhood. High-intensity, recessed lighting bathed the front room in a brilliant, clinical glow. The junk she remembered, the piles of old gears, the tangled wires, the stacks of crates were still there, but in this light they looked different. They were organized into a complex labyrinth, a deliberate maze that led toward the back of the shop. Zora moved through the aisles, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She passed a crate filled with what looked like rusted ship parts, but as she glanced down, she saw a tag attached to one, 17th century Astrolabe Vatican collection. She passed a shelf of dusty glass bottles, but the labels weren't for medicine. They were handwritten notes in her father's precise script, detailing chemical compositions she didn't understand. She reached the heavy velvet curtain that separated the shop from her father's private quarters. This was where Elias had spent his nights, hunched over a workbench, illuminated by a single lamp. Zora hesitated, her hand hovering over the fabric. She remembered Dante mocking this curtain, calling it a shroud for a failure. She pulled it back, expecting to see the cramped, messy room of a lonely old man. Instead, she stepped into a world of absolute, terrifying order. The room was vast, much larger than it appeared from the outside. The walls were lined with floor-to-ceiling mahogany shelves, and every inch was packed with leather-bound ledgers. In the center of the room stood a desk carved from a single piece of obsidian, its surface polished to a mirror shine. And there, sitting in the middle of that desk, was the iron-bound chest. Zora set the triplets down on a thick, plush Persian rug that felt like walking on a cloud. She knelt before the chest, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The word Zora was carved into the lid in her father's handwriting, but the letters were filled with what looked like liquid silver. With a trembling hand, she produced the second key, the one from her father's pocket watch. As she inserted it and turned, a soft, melodic chime echoed through the room. The lid didn't just open, it rose on hydraulic hinges, revealing a velvet-lined interior that seemed to glow from within. Zora reached in and pulled out a leather folder. Inside were deeds, not for junk shops or scrap yards, but for skyscrapers in Dubai, vineyards in Tuscany, and tech laboratories in Silicon Valley. She flipped through the pages, her mind refusing to accept the numbers. $200 million, $500 million, $1.2 billion. Beneath the deeds lay the pouches. Zora opened the first one, and a cascade of blue diamonds, each the size of a robin's egg, spilled onto the obsidian desk. They weren't cut into jewelry, they were raw, powerful, and worth more than the entire Crestview Holdings Corporation. "Oh, Papa," Zora whispered, her voice cracking as she collapsed onto the floor, the diamonds scattered around her like frozen tears. "What have you done?" She realized then that her father hadn't been a junk dealer. He had been a curator of the world's most valuable secrets. He had spent 40 years playing the part of a poor man, wearing tattered sweaters and eating canned soup, all to build a fortress for his daughter. He had watched her marry Dante, had seen her struggle to pay the rent, had watched her endure the insults of her in-laws, and he had said nothing. He had waited. He had waited for the world to show its true face to her, so that when she finally inherited his empire, she would know exactly who to trust and who to destroy. A soft, mechanical whirring sound filled the room. Zora looked up and saw one of the mahogany shelves sliding back, revealing a hidden elevator made of glass and steel. From the elevator stepped a man Zora recognized from the newspapers, Marcus Vance. He was the man the city's elite called the Eraser, the lawyer who made problems disappear for the world's most powerful people. Marcus didn't look at the diamonds on the desk. He didn't look at the deeds. He looked only at Zora. He bowed deeply and spoke in a voice that was as smooth as silk. "Good evening, Miss Morrison," he said. "Your father told me you would be arriving tonight. He also told me that by the time you reached this room, you would have a list of names. He said the first name on that list would be Dante." Marcus walked over to a wall that appeared to be solid wood and pressed a hidden sensor. The wall transformed into a massive, floor-to-ceiling digital screen. It displayed a live feed of a high-end penthouse across the city. Zora's breath caught as she saw Dante and Sloane. They were clinking glasses of champagne, laughing as they looked at a floor plan for a new house. Dante was pointing at a room, his mouth moving as he described how he would turn it into a home theater. "They are celebrating, Miss Morrison," Marcus said, his eyes reflected in the screen. "They believe you are currently sleeping on a pile of rags in the dark. They believe they have won." Zora stood up, her eyes narrowing as she looked at the man who had abandoned her at a grave. She looked at the diamonds, the deeds, and the silent, powerful lawyer standing before her. She thought of her father's quiet life, his hidden brilliance, and the key he had placed in her hand. She turned to Marcus, her voice no longer trembling. It was cold, it was hard, it was the voice of the woman her father had spent 40 years creating. "Marcus," she said, "I don't want them to stop celebrating. Not yet. I want them to have the best month of their lives. I want them to feel like they are untouchable." Marcus tilted his head. "And then, Miss Morrison." Zora reached down and picked up one of the blue diamonds, holding it up to the light. "And then," she whispered, "I want to show them what happens to people who mistake silence for weakness. I want to buy every dream Dante has ever had, and I want to watch him realize that he is just a tenant in my world." The Roz, the secret, was no longer just about the money. It was about the architecture of ruin. Zora was no longer the victim. She was the architect. For the next 7 days, Zora lived 2 lives, separated by a thin velvet curtain and a world of secrets. To the residents of 5th Street, she was the grieving daughter of the Junk King, a woman seen only in the early hours of the morning, carrying bags of groceries into the shop with her head bowed against the wind. They saw a woman in a tattered coat, her eyes weary, her spirit seemingly crushed by the weight of 3 infants and a father's death. They had no idea that once the heavy oak door was locked, that woman vanished. Beyond the curtain, Zora was a commander. The upper floor of the shop had been gutted and rebuilt in the shadows of the night. It was now a sanctuary of marble, glass, and silent technology. While the triplets slept in a nursery designed by the world's leading pediatricians, a room that monitored their every breath and heartbeat, Zora sat in a room that looked more like a high-end intelligence agency than an antique shop. Marcus Vance had brought in a team of the untouchables, financial analysts, private investigators, and cybersecurity experts who operated in the gray areas of the law. They didn't speak. They simply moved, their fingers flying over keyboards, uncovering every dark corner of Dante's life. "He is predictable, Miss Morrison," Marcus said, standing behind her as a screen displayed Dante's bank statements. "Dante has already moved Sloane into your bedroom. He has spent $30,000 in the last 48 hours on jewelry, a new lease for a sports car, and a down payment on a villa in the Hamptons. He is spending money he hasn't earned yet, banking on a promotion that he believes is guaranteed." Zora watched the numbers scroll by. She felt a twinge of the old pain, the memory of Dante telling her they couldn't afford a new stroller for the babies, while he was now showering a mistress with the fruits of his perceived victory. But the pain was different now. It was a cold, sharp instrument she used to focus her mind. "Tell me about his parents," Zora said, her voice devoid of emotion. Marcus swiped the screen to reveal the financial records of Vanguard Textiles, the firm owned by Richard and Caroline. "It's a hollow shell, Miss Morrison. They've been cooking the books for years to maintain their social standing. They are currently facing a massive supply chain lawsuit. If they don't get a $5 million infusion by the end of the month, they will lose the factory, the family estate, and their reputation. They've gone to every major bank in the city, and they've all said no." Zora leaned back in her obsidian chair, the blue light of the monitors reflecting in her eyes. "They mocked my father's funeral. They called him a junk dealer while they stood on a foundation of lies. Marcus, I want you to set up a private equity firm. Call it Phoenix Legacies. Reach out to Richard and Caroline. Offer them the $5 million. Offer them 10. Give them a grace period of 90 days. Marcus narrowed his eyes. "You want to save them?" "No," Zora whispered, a slow, predatory smile spreading across her lips. "I want to own them. I want the collateral for that loan to be the deed to their ancestral home and every single share of their company. I want them to feel the relief of being rescued, so that when I finally pull the rug out, the fall will break them beyond repair. I want them to spend that money on a lifestyle they can no longer afford." As Marcus began to execute the orders, Zora turned her attention to the most delicate part of her plan, Dante's promotion. Dante worked for Crestview Holdings, a multi-billion-dollar investment firm. He was the golden boy, the man expected to take the vice president role by the end of the month. The current majority shareholder was an aging billionaire who was looking to sell his stake quietly. "The sale is happening tomorrow night," Marcus informed her. 3 other firms are bidding. Dante is the one who prepared the valuation for Crestview to buy back its own shares. He's manipulated the numbers to make the company look more profitable than it is, ensuring his promotion as the architect of growth. Zora looked at the unpolished blue diamond on her desk. "Then we don't just buy the shares, Marcus. We buy the debt. I want to know every person Dante has ever stepped on to get to the top. I want a list of every secretary he's belittled, every junior analyst whose work he's stolen. We aren't just taking his job, we are taking his voice." That night, Zora couldn't sleep. She walked through the dark aisles of the antique shop below, her fingers brushing over the dusty crates. She found a small wooden box tucked away behind a stack of old clocks. Inside was a collection of dried flowers, the ones she had given her father over the years. He had kept every single one. Beside them was a small, handwritten note from Elias. "The world sees the rust, Zora, but they forget that iron is what holds the world together. Stay strong, my iron girl." She wept then, a silent, racking sob that she had been holding back since the cemetery. She realized that her father's life wasn't a tragedy of poverty, it was a masterpiece of devotion. He had lived in the dust so she could walk in the sun. Her grief was interrupted by a notification on her phone. It was a social media post from Sloane. It was a photo of the Triplets' nursery in Dante's house, the one Zora had spent months decorating with her own hands. The wallpaper was being torn down. The caption read, "Out with the old, in with the new, making room for a prince, not a mistake." Zora's tears dried instantly. The heat in her chest turned to ice. She picked up the phone and called Marcus. "Change of plans for tomorrow's acquisition," she said, her voice as steady as a heartbeat. "I don't just want the majority stake. I want to buy the building they work in. I want to buy the land the house stands on. I want Dante to wake up tomorrow and realize that every breath he takes is with my permission." The third secret was now in motion. Zora was no longer just a ghost in the attic. She was becoming the very air Dante breathed, a silent storm gathering strength in the shadows of a junk shop, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The morning after Zora's call, a peculiar chill settled over Crestview Holdings. It wasn't the usual crispness of an autumn day. It was the icy breath of an unspoken shift. Dante walked into the skyscraper with an extra spring in his step, still basking in the glow of Sloane's assurances. He had convinced her that the credit card issue was a mere glitch, that his future as vice president was sealed, and that their life of lavish spending was just beginning. He strode past the reception desk, his new designer briefcase gleaming, oblivious to the fact that the receptionist, a young woman named Clara he had once publicly humiliated, now held a discreet, direct line to Marcus Vance. He entered his office, a corner suite on the 40th floor, already imagining the gleaming vice president plaque on his door. He had a meeting with the CEO, Richard Thorne, scheduled for 9 a.m., the meeting where his promotion was to be formally announced, right before the majority shareholder sale was finalized. Dante sat down, his fingers drumming impatiently on his desk, already planning his celebratory lunch. His phone buzzed. It was Sloane, her voice tight with annoyance. "Dante, what is going on? The decorator for the nursery just called. They said our order for the custom crib has been canceled. Apparently our account was flagged for unexplained liabilities." "What does that even mean?" Dante scoffed. "Probably just a mix-up, Sloane. Don't let a minor inconvenience spoil our day. I have a major announcement coming. Just focus on our future, not these little bumps in the road." He was already irritated. The subtle disruptions were starting to chip away at his carefully constructed facade of control. Just then, his office door opened. It wasn't Richard Thorne, it was Clara, the receptionist, carrying a stack of beige folders. "Mr. Thorne asked me to give you these, Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice unusually flat. "He said you might need them for your 9 a.m. meeting." Dante raised an eyebrow. "What is this, Clara? More quarterly reports? I've already submitted my final projections." "I'm presenting my vision for the future, not rehashing old data." Clara placed the folders on his desk, her eyes meeting his for a fleeting second. "These are the updated proposals for the Crestview expansion, sir, and a revised valuation report for the shareholder sale, from an anonymous source." Dante dismissed her with a wave of his hand, already flipping through the top folder. He expected a few minor adjustments, nothing that would challenge his meticulously crafted narrative of exponential growth. But as his eyes scanned the first page, the color drained from his face. The numbers were off, drastically off. The projected profits were lower. The market share was smaller. And the growth strategies he had claimed as his own were now attributed to a nebulous entity called the Fifth Street Trust. He flipped to the next page, his heart beginning to pound. It was a competitor's proposal for the exact same expansion plan he had been working on for months, a plan he had leaked to a friendly rival to artificially inflate Crestview's buyback price. But this proposal wasn't a rival's. It was a comprehensive, ruthlessly accurate breakdown of Crestview's true market value, exposing all of Dante's manipulations. It even included timestamps and encrypted conversations, revealing the precise moments he had manipulated data and shared insider information. Dante heard a knock on his door. Richard Thorne, the CEO, entered, his face grim. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't offering congratulations. He simply walked to the opposite side of the desk and looked at Dante with an expression of cold disappointment. "Dante," Thorne began, his voice low, "it seems we have a problem. Your revised valuation report for the shareholder buyback, it's a work of fiction. And this counter-proposal from the Fifth Street Trust, it's alarmingly accurate. It exposes every inflated projection, every undisclosed liability, and every single insider trade you've orchestrated to boost your performance for this promotion." Dante stammered, his mind racing. "Sir, this is a smear campaign. Someone is trying to sabotage me. Zora, perhaps. Her father always hated me, and now that she's desperate, she's probably trying to take revenge with some petty stunt." Thorne held up a hand. "That's enough, Dante. The new majority shareholder has already reviewed this report, and they are not impressed. In fact, they specifically requested that you be removed from the Crestview payroll, effective immediately." Dante felt the floor drop out from under him. "Removed? But the promotion, the vice president role, I've worked for this for years." Thorne looked at him with an almost pitying glance. "Your work has just cost this company millions in potential market value, Dante, and the shareholder agreement is non-negotiable. You're fired, and I'm afraid your pension is frozen pending a full internal audit. I suggest you pack your personal belongings. Security will escort you out." The words echoed in the sterile silence of his office. Fired, pension frozen, escorted out by security. The architect of his own demise, Dante was now staring at the wreckage. He heard the muffled sound of footsteps outside his door. He knew Clara would be grinning. He knew the entire office would be watching, whispering. The very people he had stepped on were now witnessing his fall. As he stood up, his legs feeling like lead, his phone buzzed again. It was Sloane. He ignored it. He couldn't face her. Not yet. He looked around his office, the symbols of his ambition now mocking him. The expensive artwork, the polished desk, the panoramic view of the city, it was all gone. All of it had been an illusion, a glass castle built on sand. Meanwhile, a few blocks away, Zora sat in her father's transformed antique shop, a small smile playing on her lips. She watched a live feed of Dante's office building, seeing the security guards escort him out. Micah was sleeping peacefully in her arms, while Sophia and Elijah giggled softly in their playpen nearby. Marcus Vance stood beside her, a look of grim satisfaction on his face. "The first domino has fallen, Miss Morrison. Dante Hayes is no longer a part of Crestview Holdings. His career, his reputation, and his entire financial future are now in freefall." Zora looked at the tiny, perfect face of Micah. She gently stroked his cheek. "And his parents." Marcus held up a tablet displaying a news headline. Vanguard Textiles faces imminent bankruptcy as bridge loan recalled amidst fraud allegations. Marcus explained that the morality clause Zora had insisted upon was watertight. Dante's public disgrace had triggered a clause that allowed Phoenix Legacies to recall the loan immediately, forcing his parents into insolvency. They will lose everything by the end of the day, Marcus confirmed. Their factory, their estate, their entire family legacy. They will be exactly where they wanted you to be, Zora, penniless and homeless. Zora's eyes were cold, but there was no triumph in her voice, only a quiet determination. No, Marcus, they wanted me to be forgotten. I want them to be remembered as the architects of their own destruction. The fourth Raz, the ultimate secret, was that Zora wasn't just taking revenge. She was orchestrating a symphony of karmic justice, making sure that every single person who had delighted in her pain would now taste the bitter ashes of their own greed. The real reckoning was about to begin, and Dante had just taken his first step into a world where everything he owned was a loan, and the interest was his soul. Dante walked out of the Crestview skyscraper into a world that had suddenly become deafeningly quiet. The glass doors hissed shut behind him, a sound that felt like the final closing of a tomb. For years, he had walked through those doors as a god in a tailored suit. Now, he was just a man in a rumpled tuxedo, his hands shaking as he tried to hail a cab. But even the city seemed to be in on the conspiracy. Every taxi that sped past him was already occupied, and the ones that were empty didn't even slow down. It was as if he had become invisible, a ghost haunted by the very pavement he once thought he owned. He stood on the curb, the humiliation burning in his throat like acid. He pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over Sloane's contact. He needed her. He needed her to tell him that this was just a temporary setback, that they would find a way out, that her pregnancy was the reason they had to keep fighting. But when the call finally connected, there was no comfort on the other end. "Dante, don't even bother." Sloane's voice was cold, stripped of all the honeyed tones she had used to seduce him. "I watched the live stream of the gala from the car. I saw Zora. I saw what she is now. And more importantly, I saw what you aren't." "Sloane, listen to me," Dante pleaded, his voice cracking. "It's a setup. She's using her father's dirty money to frame me. We still have each other. We still have the baby." A sharp, mocking laugh erupted from the phone. "The baby." "Dante, you really are as dense as Zora always said. There is no baby. There never was. I needed a way to make sure you'd pull the trigger on that divorce before the old man died, so I gave you the story you wanted to hear. I'm not tying myself to a sinking ship, especially one that doesn't even own its own lifeboats." The line went dead. Dante stared at the dark screen, the silence of the street pressing in on him. The woman he had traded his wife for, the woman he had abandoned his newborn triplets for, had just admitted that their entire future was a fabrication. He had destroyed his life for a mirage. Desperate, he called his mother, Caroline. He expected her to be outraged, to be planning a legal counter-strike. Instead, he heard the sound of wind and traffic in the background. "Dante," she sobbed, her voice sounding thin and old. "They're here, the men from the bank. They're changing the locks on the factory. They've already towed your father's car. They said our loan was recalled because of you, because of the shame you brought to the Morrison name. They're taking the house, Dante. We have nowhere to go." "Mom, don't call us," she snapped, the grief turning into a sudden, sharp venom. "You told us she was nobody. You told us her father was a junk dealer. You brought this ruin into our home, Dante. Stay away from us." She hung up, leaving Dante standing in the middle of a city that was no longer his. He had no job, no wife, no mistress, and now no family. He was a man who had tried to build a mountain out of sand, and the tide had finally come in. He found himself walking, his feet leading him instinctively toward 5th Street. He didn't know why he was going there. Perhaps he wanted to scream at Zora. Perhaps he wanted to beg. Or perhaps he just wanted to see the place he had mocked so many times, the place that had birthed the monster that was now eating his life. When he arrived at Morrison's Curiosities, the shop looked exactly the same from the outside, dusty, forgotten, and small. He pounded on the oak door, his fists bruising against the wood. "Zora, open the door. I know you're in there. You can't do this to me. It's my life. You're stealing my life." The door didn't open. Instead, the small brass speaker above the door crackled to life. It wasn't Zora's voice that came through. It was Marcus Vance's. "Mr. Hayes," Marcus said, his voice smooth and devoid of pity. "You are currently trespassing on private property owned by the Morrison Trust. If you do not vacate the sidewalk within 60 seconds, the automated security protocols will notify the authorities. And I should warn you, given the current audit of your Crestview expenses, the police are very eager to have a word with you regarding certain offshore transfers." "Where is she?" Dante screamed, tears of rage and terror streaming down his face. "Let me talk to her." "Miss Morrison is currently occupied," Marcus replied. "She is reading to her children, a luxury you forfeited when you chose to serve legal papers at a burial. You told her she was a relic of the past, Dante. It seems you were right. You are the past. She is the future. And in her future, you do not exist." The speaker clicked off. Dante collapsed against the door, sliding down the weathered wood until he was sitting on the cold pavement. He looked at his hands, the hands that had held the divorce papers, the hands that had pushed away his children, the hands that were now empty. Across the street, a black SUV sat idling in the shadows. Inside, Zora sat in the back seat, holding Sophia. She watched the broken man on the sidewalk through the tinted glass. She didn't feel the surge of joy she had expected. She didn't feel a sense of triumph. She simply felt a profound sense of peace. The debt had been paid. The scales were balanced. "Is he going to be okay, Mama?" Sophia whispered, her small hand reaching out to touch the window. Zora looked at her daughter, the spitting image of Elias Morrison. She kissed the top of her head and pulled her closer. "He's exactly where he chose to be, sweetheart," Zora said softly. "But we are going home." She signaled to the driver, and the car pulled away, leaving the junk shop and the broken man behind. Zora looked forward, toward the hospital wing she was building, toward the thousands of mothers she was going to save, and toward the life her father had died to give her. The Junk King's daughter had finished the harvest. The secrets were all told. And as the sun began to rise over the city, Zora Morrison realized that the greatest treasure her father had ever left her wasn't the gold or the diamonds. It was the realization that she was finally, truly free. 10 years had passed since the night the lights went out on Dante Hayes' world. In the grand tapestry of the city, his name had been bleached away. A cautionary tale whispered in the boardrooms of Crestview Holdings and then forgotten. But for Zora Morrison, those 10 years had been a season of blooming, a slow, deliberate construction of a life that was as solid as the iron her father had once traded. The old antique shop on 5th Street was no longer a leaning brick relic. It had been meticulously restored, preserved not as a place of business, but as the private headquarters of the Morrison Global Foundation. The dust was gone, replaced by the scent of fresh lilies and the hum of a legacy in motion. Zora stood on the rooftop garden of the foundation building, watching the sun dip below the horizon. At 38, she carried herself with a quiet authority that required no shouting. She was no longer the woman in the tattered coat. She was a titan of industry and philanthropy, but her heart remained anchored in the nursery. "Mama, look, Micah found another one." Zora turned to see her triplets, now 10 years old, running through the garden. Micah, the most like his grandfather Elias, was hunched over a flower bed, his hands covered in soil. He held up a small, rusted gear he had unearthed from the dirt, a remnant of the old shop that Zora had intentionally scattered in the garden years ago. "It's a clock drive, isn't it?" Micah asked, his eyes sparkling with a familiar, fierce intelligence. From one of the 19th century maritime chronometers, Zora knelt beside him, brushing a smudge of dirt from his forehead. "You have a good eye, Micah. Your grandfather would have sat with you for hours explaining how that tiny piece of iron kept sailors on their course across the entire ocean." Sophia, always the bold leader, leaned over Micah's shoulder. "He said that even the smallest gear holds the weight of the whole machine, right?" "Exactly," Zora whispered, pulling them both into a hug as Elijah joined them, carrying a book of sketches. Elijah showed her a drawing he had made of the building across the street, the Elias Morrison Empowerment Center. "I saw a lady coming out of there today, Mama. She was crying, but she was smiling too. She had a little baby in her arms." "That's the most important work we do, Elijah," Zora said, her voice thick with emotion. "We give people back their smiles." The triplets knew the story of their grandfather, the Junk King, who was secretly a guardian of empires. They knew about the chest and the diamonds, but they knew very little of Dante. To them, the man who had abandoned them was merely a shadow that had been chased away by the sun. Zora had never spoken his name in anger, she simply never spoke it at all. He was a ghost with no power over their reality. Later that evening, Marcus Vance joined Zora on the balcony. He was older now, his silver hair a testament to a decade of protecting the Morrison interest. He handed Zora a thin file, the annual Audit of the Forgot. "Dante Hayes was released from state prison 6 months ago," Marcus said, his voice as clinical as ever. "He's working as a night janitor at a bus terminal in a neighboring state. He lives in a halfway house. Sloan disappeared into the Midwest under a different name after her third fraud conviction. The parents are gone, Zora. Passed away in a state-run nursing home 3 years ago." Zora looked at the file, then back at the city lights. She didn't feel a surge of vindication. She didn't feel the need to see the wreckage. "Close the file, Marcus," she said softly. "The debt was settled a long time ago. I don't want to know where they are, I only want to know where we are going." Marcus nodded, tucked the file away, and offered a rare, genuine smile. "We are going to the top, Miss Morrison, just as your father intended." As Marcus left, Zora walked back into the library where a large portrait of Elias Morrison hung. In the painting, he wasn't wearing a tuxedo or sitting in a boardroom. He was in his tattered sweater, holding a rusted key with that secret, knowing fire in his eyes. Zora reached out and touched the frame. "They saw the junk, Papa, but I see the seeds." She walked to the window and looked out at the city she now partially owned. She wasn't just a billionaire, she was a mother, a daughter, and a protector. She had taken the shards of a broken heart and forged them into a crown. The story that had begun at a grave in the rain had found its way to a garden in the sun. Zora Morrison was no longer haunted, she was free. And as her children's laughter echoed through the halls of the empire her father had built, the Junk King's daughter finally closed the book on the past, knowing that the greatest inheritance of all wasn't the billions. It was the strength to never let anyone tell her she was nothing. The legacy was complete. The Queen was home. Zora Morrison's journey began in the mud of a graveyard, but it ended in the light of a legacy that changed thousands of lives. She proved that when someone tries to bury you, they often forget that you are a seed, destined to rise stronger than the hands that tried to hold you down. Dante Hayes thought he had taken everything from a helpless woman, but he learned too late that you should never mistake silence for weakness or a humble life for a hollow one. The Junk King's daughter didn't just survive the storm, she became the architect of the rain. If this story touched your heart, if you believe that justice eventually finds its way to those who act with cruelty, then don't let Zora's journey end here. Drop a comment below with the word legacy if you believe that a mother's strength can move mountains. Tell us, What would you have done if you found that iron-bound chest in the shadows of an old antique shop? Hit that subscribe button right now and join our community at Black Women's Soul. We bring you stories of resilience, hidden empires, and the incredible power of women who turn their scars into stars. Don't miss our next story. It's even more explosive and life-changing than this one. Click the video on your screen right now to dive into another tale of betrayal and ultimate triumph. Remember, the world might see the rust, but you must always remember the iron within. Thank you for watching. Keep rising, keep shining. We'll see you in the next one.